You're listening to the Deerfield Public Library Podcast, November 9th, 2023.
Feelings were always there. They're always in capitalism. They're inextricable from our economic systems and our political systems, and they're weirder than we expect.
Welcome to the Deerfield Public Library Podcast, where we host conversations with authors, artists, academics, and others from Chicagoland and around the world. I'm your host, Dylan Zavagno, Adult Services Coordinator at the library. I have the great pleasure of presenting a conversation with Dr. Jennifer MacLure, Assistant Professor of English at Kent State University. We're speaking on the occasion of the publication of her first book, The Feeling of Letting Die, Necroeconomics and Victorian Fiction, just out from Ohio State University Press this month. The Feeling of Letting Die is a wonderful close look at how Victorian fiction explores a difficult problem at the heart of industrializing England. How can a society that's creating so much wealth also be intentionally letting a lot of people die in service of the free market? To look at how this problem registers emotionally through literature, Dr. MacLure uses classic books by George Eliot, Elizabeth Gaskell, and Charles Dickens. And Dr. MacLure also discusses lesser-known today but influential fiction like Tales of Political Economy and Deerbrook by Harriet Martineau, often known as an early sociologist, as well as a futuristic time travel novel, News from Nowhere by William Morris, known mostly for his textile and wallpaper designs. We'll jump right in because we introduce all of this and more in our conversation, but I'll just say that whether or not you are already a fan of Victorian fiction, this is both a really fun conversation and about some of the most pressing issues today. Indeed, as I think this conversation proves, that's what a study of literature allows us to do, and a reason why it's so valuable. Here's our conversation. I'm here with Dr. Jennifer MacLure, Assistant Professor of English at Kent State University and author of the recent book, The Feeling of Letting Die, Necroeconomics and Victorian Literature, out from Ohio State University Press. It is a great privilege to talk to you. Thank you for being here, and congratulations on the book.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I thought I'd say that it's apt that we both had to reschedule for having mysterious illnesses, which will become apparent why it's apt in a moment. But I thought we'd start with this idea of etiology being a word that can mean the study of the origin of a disease, but also just an origin story of any kind, how we got here. So I thought I would start this conversation by saying a little bit about how you and I came to be talking today, but then also frame the conversation as how we got to this moment in history. So I'm currently in the middle of leading a 4-part discussion series this fall at the library on Bleak House, Charles Dickens's nearly 1,000-page masterpiece. And as part of the discussion, we look at all sorts of things. So we're looking at TV adaptations and primary sources, and we're looking at criticism from readers at Dickens' time all the way through to the present. So a few weeks ago, we were looking at some influential essays on Bleak House. We looked at excerpts from J. Hillis Miller's 1971 interpretation in Dickens's Bleak House, which opens with the famous sentence, "Bleak House is a document about the interpretation of documents." We looked at D.A. Miller's classic 1983 essay. I have to say, it's so funny that it's like Miller versus Miller and Jarndyce versus Jarndyce being this court case at the center of the novel. But anyway, D.A. Miller's essay, Discipline in Different Voices, Bureaucracy, Police, Family, and Bleak House, which argues, among other things, that the characters in Bleak House are even the structure of Victorian novels. Itself, and the way it parses out information is making these disciplined Victorian subjects of a capitalist society. So we looked at that as a discussion, and we found some insights, and we found things we agreed and disagreed with. And I said, well, I want to find who's writing recently about Bleak House. And I found an essay that you published very presciently in March of 2020 called Undiagnosing Esther, the Productive Ambiguity of Disease in Bleak House. It was just as COVID lockdowns were beginning, and there's this disease that gets passed between characters in Bleak House. A lot of people assume it's smallpox because it disfigures the main character, or sometimes narrator Esther. But you point out, well, actually, the timeline might not quite work. There's some clues that might be typhus. You say that this productive ambiguity, that we're meant to have both ideas in mind at once. You say, quote, "This is crucial to the narrative project of Bleak House, which is, I argue, fundamentally concerned with thinking in multiple registers and on multiple scales at the same time." And later you say, "By representing the novel's central disease in this ambiguous way, Dickens affirms the epistemological value of fiction." I have to tell you, Jen, that the book discussion, we all cheered when we put this up on the screen. People loved this idea.
That's very nice to hear. That article was definitely came out at an interesting time. Obviously, I was writing it before I had ever heard of COVID, and the times worked out that I happened to publish it right as we were all learning that the world was going to change in ways that we hadn't predicted. But yeah, I really appreciate you picking out that quote, because that is part of why I was excited about that article. It was something that started with just curiosity on my part. I've always been interested in the history of medicine and in medicine. It's something that that's kind of been a secondary interest for me in my career. This was one of those narrative illnesses that gets talked about all the time. Esther's illness. It's so central to the plot of Bleak House, and it's so important to the plot of Bleak House and to that character. But I was just never quite satisfied with the answers of which disease this is. Part of the challenge in writing that paper was, well, why does this matter? Who cares? She's not a real person, right? She's a fictional character. So why does it matter what disease she has? We can't actually diagnose her because she's a narrative construction. But the more that I worked on it, the more that I felt like it did matter, because we have these two sort of competing discourses of disease happening at this time period. We have, the emergence of germ theory, which is so important to public health in the Victorian period and really reshapes and to the world, right? I mean, certainly helpful to us that somebody figured that out. And, the development of a lot of vaccines and a kind of contagion model that starts to understand that there are microscopic organisms that can infect us with diseases that can, take root in our bodies and spread between bodies. But at the same time, you still have a really influential strain of miasma theory, pun not intended with strain there, that is still really shaping discourse and is actually still really shaping public health policy, and not even in ways that are, I think sometimes we think of miasma theory as backward, like, oh, they hadn't figured it out yet. But, they kind of are operating under the assumption that miasma theory explains typhus. And they pretty much eradicate it with that understanding, right?
Yeah.
They don't, we now understand the vectors by which it's spread, that it's spread through like body lice. They didn't know that, but they were able to essentially eradicate it before they knew it. So you have these two simultaneously operating understandings of disease, and they correlate with two understandings of vulnerability in the world, right? Two different kind of ways of looking at scale. Maybe I'm giving Dickens a little bit too much credit that he meant to do this, but I think even if he didn't, it highlights something about what the novel is doing, which is trying to zoom back in and out between a really kind of microscopic interpersonal level and the kind of societal systemic level, and the two different versions of that disease that operate simultaneously match up with those two different modes.
Oh, I think that's a perfect way to begin, because there's so many zooming ins and outs that we'll see throughout this conversation.
Yeah.
And of course, while we're living today, specific viruses, we get actually the benefit of being able to think about a non-specific virus and what that might mean, or non-specific disease in general. After reading this wonderful essay and then seeing that you had this new book coming out this year, The Feeling of Letting Die, Necroeconomics and Victorian Fiction, I had to reach out to you, and I really felt like I was reading a kindred spirit. There's an obsession that I have that listeners to the podcast might be aware of troubling this easy formula of reading fiction equals empathy that I think a lot of libraries promote and teachers promote as sort of an easy thing. But I thought to continue our etiology here, maybe just defining some of the terms from the title of The Feeling of Letting Die, Necroeconomics and Victorian Fiction. And because we want to trouble all of these assumed assumptions, can we just start with Victorian literature? What does that mean, or Victorian fiction? What does it mean to you? Were you always a fan? How do you define it? How do you think of it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that could be the whole interview.
Sure.
We could
Yes.
talk about
We
that
could talk for hours.
but I'll resist that urge. I am specifically mostly focusing on novels, not exclusively. I also look at Harriet Martineau's Tales of Political Economy, which are not
Yes,
novels.
we'll get to that. Yeah.
Yeah, and then I guess you could call News from Nowhere a novella, depending on your definition. But most of what I'm looking at is these kind of multi-plot novels. And I think what unites all of them is that they're all episodic and showing repeated interactions, almost like laboratories. I'm thinking of them as sort of laboratories, like petri dishes. George Eliot has described her fiction in this way at times, in which we can see these larger scale concepts happening on the smaller scale level. So that's part of what, especially the vast multi-plot novel like Bleak House or Middlemarch, what really appeals to me about that kind of fiction. And we get a lot of that in the Victorian novel, partly because of publishing, partly because of the fact that a lot of literature was being published serially. So we just have these expansive episodic novels in a way that we don't have as often in some other time periods. I'm not even going to try to define the boundaries, the time boundaries of Victorian. I tend to define it quite expansively. I'm not so much in this book. It's a more traditional definition in this book. I go from the late 1820s, not technically Victorian. Queen Victoria is alive, but not queen yet, up to the 1890s. What's interesting to me about the Victorian period is much less the historical boundedness of it, and more, I view it as a time period in which the conditions of our world are being created. And they're not established yet. So they're not taken for granted yet. Right. So it's this kind of proving ground, I guess you could say, for the present. And I think looking at the Victorian period, we can see people kind of working out the things that have become obviousnesses to us that we no longer necessarily think about. So I think there's a value in defamiliarizing the present by looking at the recent past and kind of recontextualizing some things about the present. And I always think about it in terms of Eve Sedgwick, who's one of my favorite critics. She mentions in Touching Feeling the phrase, what could have happened but didn't.
Yeah.
And that always sticks in my head when I think about, why is it valuable to study literature?
Yeah.
Why is it useful? I think one of the things that can give us is a way of thinking about what could have happened but didn't, not taking the present for granted as inevitable, but as historically contingent, and it could have gone other ways. And that opens up little cracks that maybe make us think about ways in which the world could be different. I don't think it gives us a nice blueprint for how to make the world different. We can't ask too much of it, but it does open up those cracks that enable the kind of thinking that I'm excited at.
So then I think necroeconomics, that's quite a phrase that some of our listeners might never have encountered before.
Yeah. Yeah, but lots of people wouldn't have. It's not my term. It comes from Hill and Montag's book, The Other Adam Smith. That's where I'm borrowing it from. And they are drawing on Akil Mbembe's necropolitics, his term necropolitics. So there's a kind of scholarly genealogy of the word. But basically, what I mean by it is an economic system that is instrumentalizing or relying upon death in some way. So not just producing it, but kind of instrumentalizing it. And I actually use it a little bit more inclusively in this book to include instrumentalizing debility or illness as well, proximity to death. I'm interested in the way that capitalism demands death, not just produces it like as a byproduct, but as a functional part of the system.
So what we're getting in your book then is a history in some ways of our feelings about letting certain people die and letting other people live as these capitalist systems are being formed.
Yeah. And obviously my book is not a work of economics. I draw on economics, but I am certainly not an economist or, a historian of economics. So what I'm really looking at is we see in the Victorian period, like I was saying before, the kind of rise of the system that is laying the groundwork for where we end up today. And there are certain features of it. One that I focus on a lot is the idea of laissez-faire, the idea that a capitalist system is going to function best with a withdrawal of intervention, right? With as little intervention as possible, leaving things to the market to be decided. What I'm interested in is, I'm not here to prove or disprove the truth of that statement. I'm here to look at how people process what that means as it is lived in interpersonal interactions. So it's almost a mandate that you remove care in certain situations.
I kept thinking about how we've probably experienced this ourselves as children, or maybe had a child ask us, maybe you're passing a houseless person on the street and you say, well, why is that person asking for money? Why don't they have a home? And the explanations that we give or that we were given are really often centered. You can trace those explanations back through the history of these novels and through political economic theory, with all these sorts of explanations of like, well, they didn't work hard enough, or we can't take care of everybody, or the system wouldn't work, or there's all these sorts of things that knowingly or not, we're passing to each other, and we have these feelings about them, and you can sense someone's anxiety about talking about it sometimes, or as a kid, you might sense, oh, I shouldn't even go there. And I would love for you to respond to that, but I also thought it would be a good transition to talking about Harriet Martineau, who, as a 12-year-old, was a very unusual 12-year-old.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think I agree with what you're saying. I think there's nothing more Victorian about us than our understanding of merit.
Oh.
The idea of merit, I think, is so ingrained in us. And I think it is deeply Victorian. And, I think we're seeing characters in these novels having these same kind of quandaries, I guess you could say, certainly in Martineau's fiction. Yeah, Martineau is endlessly fascinating to me. She is reading Malthus when she's 12. The way that I understand Martineau is, I think she almost treats economics, political economy, free market capitalism as like providential, as a spirituality almost. I mean, she's also spiritual in other ways, but she seems to have a kind of belief in it as a natural law. She does not necessarily see capitalism, free market capitalism, as a historically contingent system that could be replaced by any number of systems. What we see in her Tales of Political Economy and in Deerbrook is her kind of tying herself up in knots, trying to figure out how to square all of this. I mean, my chapter on Harriet Martineau can come off maybe a little bit critical of her, but I think she's deeply well-intentioned. She really wants people to be healthy and happy. She really wants, that's why she's driven to write these tales of political economy, because she truly believes that the way that the poor can help themselves, the way that the working classes can help themselves, and the way that the middle class and upper classes can help those who are less fortunate than themselves is by understanding free market capitalism and modulating your behaviors to those eternal laws that you cannot change. She sees them as this kind of this constant that you can't get out of. So you see her kind of trying so hard, so hard to figure out a way to make this all work.
There's sort of a paradox there, right? Because if it's natural, she wouldn't have to teach us about it. And even these novellas, you kind of describe the flatness of the characters as a feature, not a bug. And she even will have, at the end of the novellas, summary of principles illustrated in this volume. And she'll just have maybe describing a doctor who I can't treat this poor person because that would actually mess with this natural flow of people dying who aren't worthy enough. And then she'll say at the end, have just a list of all these theses drawn from this. The more nearly and permanently market prices approach natural prices, the more prosperous is the state of commerce. And the two most essential requisites to this prosperity are social tranquility and legislative impartiality.
Yeah. Nobody has ever been more convinced of trickle-down economics than Harriet Martineau. She believes it so deeply. But yeah, I mean, they are didactic works. They're almost like parables. They have a lesson at the end. The lesson is not really a moral lesson. It's an economic lesson. It's, for example, in a Manchester strike, the lesson is basically don't strike. But her justification for that is not it's wrong to strike or you should be grateful for the work or, it's not really a moral lesson. And it's almost not even described in terms of worth, like you mentioned, who's worthy. It's almost not, she almost doesn't even use that kind of language. It's much more like the workers are misguided. It's not worth striking because if you strike, the pool of resources upon which we all subsist is going to shrink. And the only way to improve everyone's happiness and health is to increase the pool of resources or decrease the pool of people who are trying to live on those resources. So your only options, if you're a worker and you're suffering, are to not strike or to not have children and just produce less people who are going to rely on that pool of resources.
So you write, quote, Martineau essentially says to those who want to help the poor, don't trust your gut. Resist the sympathetic impulse you feel when you come into contact with suffering others.
The advice of don't trust your gut, I think that's much more her advice to the middle classes, to people of some means. Her advice to the working classes is it's pretty bleak. Yeah. But her advice to the middle classes ends up being pretty bleak too, but it's more weird, which makes it more interesting to me. I'm thinking of the scene with Dr. Burke and Louisa, his sister, trying to figure out, kind of in the situation you were describing earlier, trying to figure out what to do when people are suffering. And Dr. Burke, in this case, is a parish doctor. So he's employed by the parish to provide free care to people who can't afford it. And he has this sort of crisis of conscience, not about denying care to people, as we might expect, but about providing care to people. he has this feeling that, oh, it's going against my conscience to provide free medical care because it's going to increase the amount, increase the population. It's going to artificially kind of boost up the class of unemployed or unemployable people. And it's going to, in the long term, lead to more suffering. That's his justification. And Louisa is having the same crisis of conscience with respect to charity, women's charities that she's opting out of, and her friends are criticizing her for, but she says she has to do it because she has to follow her conscience, right? So it's about their struggle to deal with the fact that they do feel bad. They do feel sympathy for the people, but their principles tell them they need to ignore that sympathy and not feel it, because if they do, they're going to be contributing to the problem.
So let's look at maybe another model now in your next chapter of how to manage these sort of feelings that might come up. So I thought I would read a passage from North and South, Elizabeth Gaskell's novel. Listeners might be familiar. There was a 2004, I think, BBC adaptation.
Great.
This novel was published in Household Words, Dickens's journals, I think right after Bleak House and Hard Times. And we have this sort of paradigmatic visit of a middle-class character to a poorer character. Margaret Hale, she's 19. She moves with her father up north from London to an industrial city, right, with a cotton mill, and she's visiting Bessie Higgins. So I think that sets this up enough, and I'll read this little paragraph or two about the fluff in the factory. And I'd love for you to tell us just how this sort of twists that little knot in a different way. Fluff, repeated Bessie, little bits as fly off from the cotton when they're carding it and fill the air till it looks all fine white dust. They say it winds round the lungs and tightens them up. Anyhow, there's many a one as works in a carding room that falls into a waste, coughing and spitting blood, because they're just poisoned by the fluff. But can it be helped? Asked Margaret. I don't know. Some folks have a great wheel at one end of their carding rooms to make a draft and carry off the dust, but that wheel costs a deal of money, £500 or £600 maybe, and brings in no profit. So it's but a few of the masters as will put 'em up, and I've heard tell of men who didn't like working in places where there was a wheel, because they said as how it made 'em hungry. And after they'd been long used to swallowing fluff, to go without it, and that their wage ought to be raised if there were to work in such places. So between the masters and men, the wheels fall through. I know I wish there'd been a wheel in our place, though.
Yeah, the fluff. Yeah, it's it's kind of a funny passage if it weren't so dark.
Right.
So, yeah, so basically she works in a carding room. So, this is a textile factory. They're basically piecing apart the cotton and preparing it, carding it, preparing it to be spun. And a lot of women worked in those rooms as well. That was, a spot where you would have a lot of women working in the factory. And it's just flying all around. It's this sort of industrial hazard. They're breathing it in, but they actually don't want to fix that industrial hazard, because it's only increasing the starvation that they're already experiencing, the malnutrition and the hunger that they're experiencing. So yeah, it's an interesting moment. I think even just from that passage, I think it's clear that Gaskell is a lot less sympathetic to the ideology of free market capitalism as a natural law compared to Martineau.
Right.
Martineau really gives everyone the benefit of the doubt. She really believes, nobody seems to be making a real exorbitant profit in Martineau's capitalism. She wealth inequality kind of disappears in Martineau's capitalism. She really believes that it's all being reinvested. She doesn't really address the possibility of someone sort of hoarding wealth. Gaskell doesn't have quite the same degree of faith in capitalism. She's not exactly anti-capitalist. The only author in the book who really is genuinely anti-capitalist in a political sense is William Morris. But she's willing to look at the ways that things don't always operate according to these perfect rules that Martineau thinks they do.
You say, perhaps surprisingly, Gaskell's critique shares more with that of the revolutionary socialist angles than with liberal reformers like Chadwick, in that she presents working class debility as an operative technology, not an accidental byproduct of industrial capitalism. That's what we're seeing with this fluff, that it's actually intentionally keeping workers at this kind of barely subsistence level.
Yeah, she's showing that this sort of workplace hazard, this way of making them closer to death, is operative for capitalism. And the same thing happens with the strike in North and South, and in Mary Barton to some extent, that we see a situation where the workers' proximity to death is helpful for the mill owners. The fact that the workers can't hold out and strike for nearly as long as the mill owners can, because they're going to starve to death. So their debility makes them into sort of more docile workers, which is counterintuitive in a way, because we would assume that mill owners would want the healthiest, strongest workforce, right? Like that would be the assumption. But what we see is something a little bit different, that it's actually productive for them. It's useful for them to keep people right on the edge of death, not quite necessarily dead, but close enough, closer than themselves.
So Gaskell's solution, though, is quite weird. You kind of call it very strange, where she does have this critique of capitalism, but her solution is sort of kind of contrasting with Martineau as checking those gut feelings. She almost wants like an overflow of feeling, but also this is all centered in a kind of middle-class woman manager. It's very interesting.
Yeah, it's very weird. Martineau and Gaskell both tie themselves up in knots in different ways. They, it's kind of like, it goes back to something you said at the beginning about, does reading necessarily produce empathy? I think maybe the question here is, does sympathy necessarily undermine capitalism? And I think that she ends up tying herself up in knots because the logical conclusion, it feels like, of where she's going is to unleash sympathy and let it kind of bubble up through and unsettle capitalism in this really radical way. But she's not quite willing to go there. She is still attached to the status quo in a lot of ways and attached to capitalism. And so she ends up doing this weird, like, rerouting thing where she wants to, what we get at the end is a woman who has sort of been produced by capitalism as a sympathy machine. That's something that I see happening in Gaskell. She's noting how sympathy is kind of squashed in certain areas. It's squashed in the mill owners. It's squashed between classes, but it is supplemented by middle-class women. They are kind of trained and disciplined in the opposite way to amplify that sympathy and to fill in those gaps. But instead of imagining just eradicating all of that affective management and emotional management that she sees as necessary, she just says, well, okay, in that case, give the means of production to the middle-class women and let them sort of wield them, not in a paternalistic way, but in a sort of maternalistic way, as these sympathy-driven managers of capital. So it's not, she doesn't end up giving a real blueprint for actual systemic change. I don't think this is really a feasible or a desirable outcome, but it's really interesting because she's so showing how feelings get sort of warped through capitalism, produced in some places, squashed in other places, and it can have these results that aren't quite expected. She almost goes there of saying we need to change this on a systemic level, but she kind of averts that at the end, and we end with a spoiler alert with a marriage.
Yes. Yeah, and even with the marriage, I have to tell you, I loved this footnote where you quote from a critic, Rachel Ablow, who compares Victorian novels to a wife in that they, quote, reproduce values associated with the home, encourage sympathy, and help us maintain and cultivate our best selves. And then you say, but in my reading, Gaskell's novels are more like unmarried women. They represent the potential for excessive sympathy, which, when routed in particular ways, can disrupt the effective structure of capitalism. I thought that was such a fun reading.
Thank you. Yeah, Rachel Ablow is a great critic. That's, definitely read her book if you're interested in literature and sympathy. But yeah, I think, there's something going on with, the kind of fixing of sympathy into the wife. And I think the fact that Margaret is unmarried throughout most of the book is important, that she's representing this like free radical of sympathy, in the, not radical in the political sense, but in the chemical sense. And there are moments where that sympathy seems like it threatens to really unsettle the structure, the economic structure around her.
So now we come to your third chapter on Bleak House, titled Letting Die Slowly, Necroeconomic Pleasure in Dickens's Bleak House. And of course, the subject of our book discussion here at the library. I thought I might start by just asking you to even try to describe Bleak House or the world it's presenting, because it's so encyclopedic. I'll just read the opening lines just to give an idea of this third-person omniscient narrator who's sort of cynical and mournful and outraged, but also essentially unaffected because he's not a real person, right?
Right.
So it famously opens, London, Michaelmas term lately over, and the Lord Chancellor sitting in Lincoln's Inn Hall, implacable November weather, as much mud in the streets as if the waters had but newly retired from the face of the earth, and it would not be wonderful to meet a megalosaurus 40 feet long or so, waddling like an elephantine lizard up Holborn Hill.
Yeah, I love Bleak House. A lot of times when people ask me my favorite Victorian novel, I often say Bleak House. It's hard to choose, but Middlemarch is up there as well. But Bleak House feels so characteristically Victorian to me. And I think part of the reason is a little bit of what we talked about before, that it is this kind of zooming in and out. One of the unique features of Bleak House is that it alternates between a third-person narrator, kind of omniscient, unnamed, impersonal narrator, and Esther's first-person narration. Esther at the center of this as the kind of this orphan child who is just trying to do her duty and win some love to herself. That's not an exact quote, but it's something like that.
Some little love to herself. That's
some little love.
Yes.
Yeah. People have really diverse reactions to Esther, I think, depending on their
There's
reading
this
style.
So-called Esther problem, right? The Esther problem, that some people just find her so unbelievable, right?
Right. And then I've known other folks, I'm gonna call out my mother here, who just love Esther because she is such a likable character if you like likable characters. And she's, an unbelievable character if you want somebody who's more flawed, right? Esther she's so consistently good and humble and trying her very best, and almost faultless as a character.
Yeah.
So
faultless
we're getting
to a fault. Yeah.
Yeah. Faultless to a fault. Yeah. So we're getting her view on this world, this deeply flawed world around her. And her attempts to navigate it, paired with a much more cynically voiced third person narration. So it's an interesting combination. And we get those two viewpoints through spanning a lot of social problems, all of which center around Chancery, the Court of Chancery, which is, in this case, mainly we're focusing on wills and inheritances, like civil court, not criminal court. And at the center is the Jarndyce fortune, right? The Jarndyce and Jarndyce case, which is there is a fortune. Somebody had a lot of money at one point, and that person died, and there was a lack of clarity about who inherited that money. And the case has been going on for generations, we're told. Children were born into the case, grew up, and have children of their own. So it's this kind of endlessly proliferating, endlessly prolonged court case that seems to be going nowhere. So it's certainly an indictment of bureaucracy, as Dickens loves to do, but also that case gives us a way into a lot of other social problems. Like we find out that the slum that we find out about in the book Tom All Alone's is in Chancery, right? It is also kind of wrapped up in this court case. And then Richard and Ada, Esther's two companions, also are wards in the case and have some sort of expectations. And then we have Jarndyce, who's also kind of involved in the case. So all these people kind of come together around this court case.
So Jarndyce takes them into his house, which is Bleak House. So now we have this kind of existential orphan, Esther, who's seeing all of these characters deal with other orphans, right? And she's seeing how they're failing at passing on a good inheritance or teaching, right? So one of these terrible characters that you focus on is Harold Skimpole, who's just this amazing creation of Dickens, apparently based on Leigh Hunt, the poet critic. And he just goes around saying, oh, I'm just a child. I don't understand money. He's mooching off all of his friends, and he wants no responsibility. He's not paying attention to his own children. And back to this disease that happens and gets passed through the characters, right? This little orphan boy who does not have any potential grand inheritance, like Esther is intimated to, comes into their lives and into Bleak House when he's very ill. In Skimpole, you focus on this moment where Skimpole pushes him out and says, absolutely not. So I'm going to read two quotes side by side. One is Esther talking about Skimpole after she's recovered from her illness, and then a quote by Michel Foucault that you also quote. So Esther says, he was charmed to see me, said he had been shedding delicious tears of joy and sympathy at intervals for 6 weeks on my account, had never been so happy as in hearing of my progress, began to understand the mixture of good and evil in the world now, felt that he appreciated health the more when somebody else was ill, didn't know but what it might be in the scheme of things that A should squint to make B happier in looking straight, or that C should carry a wooden leg to make D better satisfied with his flesh and blood in a silk stocking. And then Foucault, describing his concept of biopolitical racism, says, the fact that the other dies does not mean simply that I live in the sense that his death guarantees my safety. The death of the other, the death of the bad race, of the inferior race, or the degenerate or the abnormal, is something that will make life in general healthier and pure. So, Jen, you must have been astonished when you realized these two quotes fit together so well. I mean, Dickens is anticipating Foucault by 120 years or so. What did you think realizing this connection?
To be honest, this is the thing that I probably struggled most with in the book, is the relationship between kind of economic exploitation and racism. Right?
Yeah.
And there are a lot of people who know a lot more about that relationship than I do, but it came up over and over again as I was trying to kind of figure out on an emotional and interpersonal level, how does exploitation work? What does it look like? Like, how does it play out? What kinds of interactions make it possible to exploit another person? And I became more and more convinced it's inseparable from racism. They're not the same. There's lots of important differences, but they're related. And it's impossible to think one without the other, I think. And I think it's Ruth Gilmore who defines racism as like a differential. I don't have the quote.
The state-sanctioned and or extra-legal production and exploitation of a group differentiated vulnerability to premature death.
Yes, that's it. Yes, it's Ruth Gilmore who describes racism in that way as, it's a group differentiated vulnerability to death. Some groups are more vulnerable to death than others. And reading that definition, I learned her work after I had written part of the Gaskell chapter. So in which I'm talking about group differentiated vulnerability to death, but not in the context of race. I'm talking about it in the context of, an all European white domestic British population. So trying to kind of parse that out was challenging. And I think the thing that is uniting is the affective mechanics of it, the emotional mechanics, the way that the interpersonal reaction produces the kinds of boundaries that make exploitation possible. And that's kind of what Skimpole is describing, that idea of, like, how do you get it in your head that somebody else's suffering is going to translate into your thriving, right? That there's this kind of inverse relationship between different groups of human beings or between individual human beings.
Well, and you even say that the sort of analytic gap, I think you call it, that Foucault has in kind of generalizing racism without talking about the specifics is also true of Dickens, right? He's writing about this very white world, so it's useful. And the thing that you add that I think is very applicable to all sorts of things is this idea of boundary pleasure, right? So Harold Skimpole, not only is he forcing out the diseased orphan because he doesn't want to get sick, he does that and then immediately goes and sings a song about how wonderful poor orphans are. And there's this like joy in not just putting people on one side of that boundary. It almost doesn't matter if they actually die, right? It's just a joy in knowing that they're there. I actually found the sheet music of this song. Okay, so I'm not going to sing it.
Oh my gosh.
But I have to read you the words because it's so amazing. Dickens puts this real song in the book. He's quoting from this real song, The Peasant Boy by John Perry, a ballad. Thrown on the wide world, doomed to wander and roam, bereft of his parents, bereft of a home, a stranger to pleasure, to comfort and joy, behold, little Edmund, the poor peasant boy. O pity, the poor peasant boy. And then the second verse, I'm willing to labor, I'm willing to toil, for fortune will ever on industry smile. But not a creature will deign to employ a wanderer like Edmund, the poor peasant boy. And there's that going right back to that merit. Isn't that incredible?
Wow, what an artifact.
I know.
Good researching.
Thank you.
I mean, there's so much to say about this moment. I think it kind of is the key element of what I'm trying to figure out with this book, which goes back to what you said at the beginning about complicating our assumptions about feelings and their relationship to A, capitalism, and B, literature. So I think we sometimes have this assumption that on the one side you have like cold, hard capitalism, very rational, very, economics, very rational, very scientific, very objective, no feelings involved. And then on the other side, you have soft, squishy feelings that are fundamentally separate from economics. And that leads to the assumption that if you introduce feelings into capitalism, it will necessarily improve the situation. And what I'm arguing in this book is that feelings were always there. They're always in capitalism. They're inextricable from our economic systems and our political systems, and they're weirder than we expect. Sometimes feelings can operate in service of capitalism, and sometimes they can operate in service of disrupting capitalism. It just depends on the feelings. And in this case, I'm investigating what is the feeling that motivates the production of these kinds of boundaries that enable exploitation. And like you said, I'm not saying it's just that people accept that they might have to exploit somebody, like the way that Martineau might have figured it. Dr. Burke and Louisa are not taking any pleasure in withdrawing care from the paupers that they are responsible for. They feel bad about it, but they do their duty by withdrawing care and not providing essential goods to people who need them. But Dickens, I think, is a lot more agnostic about economics. I mean, he's not making a point the way that Martineau is. He's exploring a little bit more rather than being didactic in the same way. So he kind of digs into this pleasure that people feel, this kind of almost macabre pleasure in the production of a boundary between the self and particularly a suffering other. So we see it with Skimpole and Joe. We see it with Mrs. Particle.
Yeah, tell us about her. Yeah.
Oh, she's so funny. Although I don't think you'd want to hang out with her. She's one of Dickens' female philanthropists. He has a couple in the novel, and they don't come off great in the novel. And, a lot of people have read that as kind of a point about gender, a suggestion that women should stay out of public life. And I think there's merit to that point. It's not a pro-feminist representation of women,
Right, sure.
But I think there's more to it as well. And Mrs. Particle is a philanthropist, but I kind of have to put that in air quotes because she's really not doing anything of much value. She's really just doing a lot of this visiting. She is visiting the poor. She is visiting people who are suffering. And what she does when she gets there is basically harangue them, tell them what they should be doing instead, read them sermons that they don't understand or care about, and she offers very little to actually improve their lives. She doesn't seem to be even really trying to improve their lives. What she seems to be doing is taking pleasure in going into these homes and kind of asserting a difference between herself and the people that she is interacting with. And she's often described, all these interactions are often described in terms of iron, she's like metallic, she's unmoved, she's almost like a statue. There's a way in which she's interacting with these people, but she's not open in any way. There's no actual flow between them. Nothing is passing back and forth. It's just she's going into a space, being around people, and the content of that interaction is asserting the boundary between them, the separation between them.
Yeah, you call it a quasi-sadistic compulsion that she has to reaffirming this boundary. It's both funny, but such a scathing critique of how many people encounter others. I wanted to turn to Esther's radical inclusion of Joe as sort of being perhaps Dickens's solution or kind of counter story in this problem of sympathy that we're all discussing here, but Esther wants to include this sick orphan Joe, right? And then she gets sick herself. So even to the point of getting his disease. And of course, again, Joe is just paradigmatic orphan, and she's including even him. And I have to ask you about this because tying this chapter in the book to my reading of your essay, Undiagnosing Esther, it made me realize something that I want to try out as a theory on you.
Please.
So this idea that we could have, you call it like a contagious community, like a healthy epidemic of sympathy and empathy, right? That Esther could just include everyone. On the one hand, this is sort of a problem because Esther has to be like traumatized to become this perfect person. But when you tying again to this earlier essay with these two possible diseases, you note that the first person, Esther, there's more clues that it's smallpox with her in her chapters. But with the third person, there's more clues that it's typhus, this sort of miasmic thing. And that in this same chapter, where Skimpole is throwing out Joe and then singing a song about him, Nurse and Patient, chapter 31, you write that Esther actually has this weird moment of taking on the voice of the narrator when she's describing these very slums, Tom All Alone's. I'll quote from your earlier essay, Undiagnosing Esther. Quote, Esther's first-person account, the description of Joe's residence of Tom All Alone's as a fever nest from which typhus patients are being carried out by the dozens, take place in an earlier third-person chapter. Moreover, even within her first-person narration, Esther's voice takes on an odd third-personness at the moment when she first encounters Joe, whose symptoms will seem to indicate typhus. Her self-effacing voice drops away as she describes the sky as a, quote, sea-stricken immovable as it was heaving over the dark waste of London. She goes on to describe an experience of self-alienation, suggesting a kind of depersonalization of the narrative voice. Quote, I had for a moment an undefinable impression of myself as being something different from what I was. Okay, I'm going to keep going here because if you keep going with that quote where Esther's having this feeling, now she might be getting ill, but she's also having this boundary crossing even in terms of narrative, right? Mm-hmm. So she goes on, I know it was then and there that I had it. I have ever since connected the feeling with that spot in time and with everything associated with that spot in time to the distant voices in the town, the barking of a dog and the sound of wheels coming down the miry hill. It was Saturday night, and most of the people belonging to the place where we were going were drinking elsewhere. We found it quieter than I had previously seen it, though quite as miserable. The kilns were burning, and a stifling vapor set towards us with a pale blue glare. So I think this is one of the most beautiful passages in the book. I love this. I kept thinking, pale blue glare, that's so beautiful. And then on my ebook copy of Bleak House did a search for pale blue glare. What I found was that the narrator later in the book uses the same language. I don't know if anyone's written about this before, to talk about those same slums. And it's in chapter 56, Pursuit, which is when the narrator, for the only time, this third-person narrator mentions Esther in passing. And they're finding Esther's mother. They're in pursuit of Esther's mother. And near the end of the chapter, on the waste where the brick kilns are burning with a pale blue flare, where the straw roofs of the wretched huts in which the bricks are made are being scattered by the wind, where the clay and water are hard frozen, and the mill in which the gaunt blind horse goes round all day looks like an instrument of human torture traversing this deserted, blighted spot. There is a lonely figure with a sad world to itself, pelted by the snow and driven by the wind, and cast out, it would seem, from all companionship. Now, it's pale blue glare versus pale blue flare, but I think this must have been, if not intentional, somewhere in Dickens' subconscious, that we're actually getting, the borders are shifting or being crossed or dismantled in the narrative structure itself. Am I onto something here?
You're blowing my mind. You need to write it. You need to write the article. I mean, yeah, I think that absolutely hits for me, because I think what makes Esther interesting is not her merit, but her the way that she seems to make possible real trans individual interactions, real intimacy in a platonic sense, the real communication between people, where something is actually transferred between them, which is the opposite of Mrs. Particle, where she's going to go have interactions, but nothing is being transferred. She's not being changed in any way. She's just hardening her shell, hardening the shell around her. Whereas with Esther, when we see it in her interactions with Caddy, in her interactions with a number of characters in the book, she is open in a way that some of the other characters are not. It's not a good solution, just like Margaret's is not a good solution, because it seems to demand the complete selflessness of this central woman, this woman character at the center of the plot. And she is, I mean, even that passage, there is a selflessness in a different sense, where she seems to be kind of evacuating herself. And that's the threat of this kind of trans individuality in a flawed world. I think we see something similar in Morris. I think Morris describes characters who are similarly open and really deeply influenceable by the people around them, right? They are permeable to other people's feelings, and other people are permeable to theirs. But because Morris is setting those characters in a post-capitalist utopia in the future, they're fine. Right? It's not harmful to them, because they're in a world that is not entirely free of suffering, but almost. So they're not having to kind of process massive systemic inequalities through their own person, the way that Esther seems to be asked to do so.
Well, so this is in your last chapter, William Morris, who probably people most know as sort of a wallpaper textile designer, right? Mm-hmm. He was a committed socialist, and this novel News from Nowhere is so wild, and perhaps you can describe the plot, but it's sort of amazing that your study starts and ends with the flattest characters. This book, well, I'll have you set it up, but it's just, I was so fascinated I had to read it, but it's not the best reading experience.
No, it's not. No, you're absolutely right. The book starts and ends with the works that are least currently read and taught, and there's a reason for that. They're certainly the most polemical, the most didactic, the most directly engaged with economic policy. Martineau on one side of the spectrum as a very committed capitalist, and Morris on the other side of the spectrum and the other side of the century as a committed socialist. And basically the book, it's a time travel story. It's sort of the most boring time travel story you can imagine. I'm not selling it very well here, but I really enjoy it. Sometimes it's nice to take a little break from the world and go live in News from Nowhere for a little while.
Yes,
He starts it with a character who is a socialist and is not having a great time doing the work of socialism in 1890s England, falls asleep, wakes up, and he has traveled into the future. He changed the date a couple of times as it became more and more apparent that it was going to take a little longer to get to this world that he was envisioning. But it's not far in the future. He's setting it in the 20th century. So he's writing at the end of the 19th and setting it either in the middle to end of the 20th century, depending on the edition. The whole story is basically just this guest character. He calls himself Guest and travels through this world with a variety of guides and learns about how the world is now. And spoiler alert, it's great. The world is great. A lot of things have improved. It's sort of an agrarian, almost anarchic society. There's some form of politics, but not really. Only on a very local level. There's no nation states, no prisons, no courts.
The chapters will end with sort of I'm thinking of one chapter where he says, well, what do you do about poor people? And the person leading him around says, poor people? Well, why would a poor person be outside? If they're sick, they would be inside. He says, no, like poorly. And he's like, I don't know what poor people are. Like, they just, it's like totally removing this, the knot that we've been describing. It's just like, let's just imagine if it weren't there at all.
Right. It's a society with no poverty. There are certain things, he keeps things like sexual jealousy. Right? There are still some things where you can still get your feelings hurt in utopia, but nobody is truly in one. And people still get sick sometimes, although the people are a lot healthier and beautiful. He really emphasizes that everybody looks great. Everybody's in great shape. Everybody's having a great time, more or less. Yeah. But there's another moment similarly where his baffled guide is just confused by every question that he asks. And the one that I think is perhaps the most telling is when he asks about prisons. And the guide, Hammond, says is like offended. He's quite offended at the question and says something along the lines of, didn't you just say everyone you've encountered seems happy and joyful? How could we ever be happy if we knew that people were in prison suffering? And it's sort of, he ends up feeling a lot like somebody like Esther, right? This kind of model emotional character, this radically permeable, even more than Esther, radically permeable, emotionally permeable characters who say, well, I could never be happy if somebody else was suffering. It's the opposite of Skimpole. Who is sort of taking pleasure in other people's suffering and feeling separate from it. There's no boundary there. If somebody else is suffering, they are also suffering. But obviously you can't be that in a world full of suffering, or it would just be terrible. So, that kind of radical permeability is not tenable in a world that is full of suffering. So in some ways I see News from Nowhere as Morris's attempt to imagine what feelings would look like. Yeah. How would people be emotionally different? How would those patterns be different?
But what's so astonishing to me is that you compare Morris and News from Nowhere, again, totally wooden characters, to the realist novelist par excellence, George Eliot and Middlemarch, and say, well, look, this is also a time travel novel. We're going back into the past, and we're sending this character who's going to have that permeability to all the people that she meets. And it was, I think, perhaps out of a book of many astonishing arguments, that was the one that shocked me the most.
Well, thanks, I guess.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, it's an unusual pairing for sure. Those two, I don't know that they've been written about together, maybe somewhere. News from Nowhere and Middlemarch and Felix Holt. But what I was struck by is the affective similarity of the character, of the rather wooden characters in News from Nowhere, with the deeply alive, wonderful characters, some of my favorite characters in Middlemarch and Felix Holt. Felix himself is certainly like this in Felix Holt, but also some of my favorite characters in Middlemarch: Caleb Garth, Dorothea. There are a number of these characters who seem to have utopian feelings, right? They're much like Esther, but even more than Esther, I would say. They have these sort of utopian feelings characteristic of Morris's future, but in the past. And not even in Eliot's present,
Right.
but in the past, right? Both of those novels are retrospective, set a few generations before Eliot is writing.
Well, I think it sort of ties together a lot of things that we've been thinking about, where if novels don't automatically give you empathy, or if sympathy doesn't automatically counter capitalism, in the same way, characters wooden or not, set in the future or not, and in fiction, anything's open. So if it's a social novel, if it's written with a purpose or not, none of those things are necessarily going to determine the outcome of you encountering a text. And I think that is the thing that I loved about your work so much. And I thought we would end by just having you read maybe the last paragraph from the conclusion, because I think it's such a great way to tie all this together. Some of thinking about all these different ways we feel about these knotty problems made me want to throw up my hands and say, well, then it doesn't matter what I think or feel. But I think you have a rousing conclusion for us.
I want to push beyond an assertion of mere relevance to make a hopeful claim for these novels' enduring value as tools for understanding our world. I was compelled to write this book by my belief in the radical potential of feeling, the power of interpersonal, affective, and emotional exchange to reshape macro-level systems. This project has only further persuaded me. Feeling does have, I believe, immense potential to shape political and economic systems, to make them work or to make them not work. But that potential can be captured, routed, and mobilized in all kinds of ways. Victorian novels show us that the feelings that arise in response to necroeconomics are multidirectional, dangerous, and unpredictable. Feeling can flow through a hegemonic system as its lifeblood, animating its power, or like kerosene, working its way into every gear and just waiting on a match. Reading these novels in the context of the problem of letting die, we are left not with a facile account of sympathy's inherent power to overcome hierarchy and division. Rather, we are challenged to attend to the complex dynamics of feelings that shaped necroeconomics in the Victorian period and still shape these forces today. Methodologically, this means looking at these authors not as the unacknowledged legislators of the world, nor as well-meaning but hopelessly indoctrinated old fools who perpetuated the very cultural hegemony against which they positioned themselves, but rather as our predecessors in a continued struggle to figure out feeling under capitalism. I do not want to suggest that these novels contain the answers, nor, on the other hand, that they express out-of-date ideologies that I, from the other side, can reveal as flawed. There is no other side. We are still in it. Taken beside us, these novels offer insight not only into how we got here, but also, as Eve Sedgwick puts it, into what might have happened but didn't. In a world that increasingly resembles dystopian fiction, we need all the tools we can get for imagining the world that we might still create.
Thank you so much, Jen. I loved this book and I loved getting to talk to you. So thank you very much for being here.
Thank you so much. It was really a pleasure.
You can check out The Feeling of Letting Die, Necroeconomics and Victorian Fiction by our guest, Dr. Jennifer MacLure, here at the library in our podcast collection. That's our show. Thank you so much to Jen for all of her time, as well as to Olivia at Ohio State University Press. And thank you for listening to our 61st interview episode. Comments and feedback are always welcome and can be sent to podcast@deerfieldlibrary.org. Go to deerfieldlibrary.org/podcast to learn more about our show and find links to subscribe. You can also follow the library on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, or check out our YouTube channel. Links are on our website or in our show notes. I also need to say a very special thank you. In fact, I don't think I'll ever adequately be able to thank a person who's been behind the scenes of our podcast since we began this show 7 years ago, our outreach coordinator, Judy Hoffman, who is retiring at the end of the month. Judy has served as producer, idea, bouncer offer, advisor, confidant, and introducer to the wider world of podcasting and the wider community. Judy, my dear mentor, colleague, and friend, thank you for everything, and we wish you all well. We'll be back with another conversation soon. Thanks for listening.